I didn't buy the land for power. I bought it for peace. That quiet strip of countryside with its broken-down fencing and overgrown mesquite had once been my grandfather's. It had sat untouched for 20 years, just waiting for someone in the family to care again. And when the board at the energy firm I ran signed off on my semi-retirement package, along with the transfer of certain utility easements to my name, I knew exactly where I was going. My name's Alan Merrick. I spent 28 years designing and maintaining energy infrastructure for 4 states. Grid management, substation acquisition service optimization. You name it, I'd seen it. And after decades of high-rise meetings and federal briefings, all I wanted was dirt under my boots and the kind of silence that lives between cottonwood trees. I had no intention of causing trouble. My ranch project wasn't commercial. I wasn't putting in a hotel or factory. I just wanted to build a small solar-integrated homestead. A mix of restored prairie hydroponic vegetables, a few goats and chickens, maybe an education center for local schools to visit, see where real food came from. I'd even hired a local architect who specialized in low-impact heritage, builds everything designed to blend with the land and meet every code. But HOA Karen didn't care about that. The problem began before the first fence post went in. I was walking the property line one morning with a surveyor clipboard in hand, sunrise at our backs, when a silver Lexus pulled up along the gravel road. I remember how she got out fast, purposeful, like she'd practiced this confrontation in the mirror. "You can't build there," she called across the ditch. "That land's part of the visual perimeter agreement." I blinked. "Excuse me. The HOA governs this stretch. All development must be pre-approved by the Community Aesthetic Board." I told her calmly that this was private property, zoned rural, outside the subdivision limits, and that there was no perimeter agreement in my deed. She frowned, clutching a slim red binder under her arm, like it was a Bible. "I'm Karen Holt, Vice President of the Meadow Hills HOA. We've maintained the character of this corridor for years. If you introduce livestock or farm structures, it'll lower surrounding property values." I should have walked away right then. But I'm not wired like that. Instead, I nodded. "Well, Ms. Holt, I'd be happy to meet your board and present the plans. I've hired a certified green builder and reviewed all county code. This project meets every legal requirement." She gave a tight-lipped smile. "We'll see about that." And with that, she turned and drove away, kicking up a cloud of limestone dust in her wake. At the time, I didn't take it too seriously. I'd dealt with harder personalities in corporate boardrooms. Karen just seemed like one of those overzealous neighbors who liked to meddle. I figured she'd go home, flip through her bylaws, and realize she had no jurisdiction. But I underestimated just how deeply HOA politics had seeped into this area. Within a week, I got a letter. Not from the county, this was a violation notification on Meadow Hills letterhead. According to the HOA, my land interfered with the protected visual buffer, and any construction would result in daily monetary penalties and referral to legal counsel. I laughed at the absurdity. The HOA's boundaries ended half a mile west of my fence line. But I knew how this worked. Most people wouldn't fight back. Most people just folded, too tired or uninformed to argue. Not me. I called a lawyer, a local zoning expert named Carla Price, and she confirmed exactly what I thought. "They're bluffing, Alan. That HOA has no jurisdiction on your land. It's intimidation." Still, I decided to respond in good faith. I wrote a professional letter to Karen and her board, attaching copies of my deed, the zoning maps, and an invitation to meet in person. I never got a response. Instead, I got a drone, a small buzzing quadcopter that began hovering over my property every few mornings. At first, I thought it was a hobbyist, but then I noticed the pattern. It always showed up when I had workers on site or when delivery trucks rolled in. One afternoon, it hovered so low over my survey team that one of the guys threw a rock at it. The thing zipped off like a hornet. I filed a complaint with the sheriff's office, but they told me the airspace was legally gray. Unless I could prove the drone was being used for harassment, there wasn't much they could do. Karen, of course, denied all involvement. "We encourage all residents to be vigilant about changes to our shared environment," she wrote in a passive-aggressive community newsletter. "While the HOA cannot control private citizen action, we do support transparency and awareness." It was clear then she wasn't going to stop. Still, I held my ground. I pushed forward with the initial groundwork. The soil testing came back strong, the permits cleared, and the moment my contractor set the first marker flag, I felt something inside me settle a deep, bone-level peace. This land was becoming mine again. But that peace didn't last long. 2 days later, I woke to find orange construction cones blocking my driveway. A laminated paper was zip-tied to my mailbox, stop work order, subject to neighborhood review. It wasn't from the county. It wasn't legal. But it looked official, just real enough to make a passerby think I was doing something shady. That's when I realized this wasn't just Karen trying to protect her view. This was a power play. And unfortunately for her, she had no idea how deep my connections to power ran. I didn't react right away when I saw the orange cones. I stepped out onto the gravel with a mug of coffee in one hand, stared at the laminated stop work order, and let the early morning air settle around me. My foreman, Rico, had just pulled up in his truck behind the cones and gave me a look that asked, "Are we seriously dealing with this again?" I gave a slow shake of my head. "This isn't county issued," he said, pointing to the printed header. "Says Neighborhood Planning Committee. That's not even a legal body." "I know," I replied. "They're just playing dress up." But the problem was, it was working on perception, if nothing else. My neighbors, the ones not directly involved with Karen's HOA, had started whispering. One of them, a retired librarian named June, even stopped by to ask if I had cleared everything with the proper people. She used that phrase like there was a priesthood of permission I had ignored. I stayed patient, explained that my land was outside HOA jurisdiction, that every permit I needed was already in hand. She nodded, but I could see it in her eyes. Doubt. Doubt seeded by Karen's campaign. A few days later, it escalated. I received a registered envelope in the mail, certified notice of violation, this time on more polished stationery. It was from the legal department of Meadow Hills, HOA, signed with a flourish by their contracted attorney, some firm I'd never heard of that probably handled property disputes and overblown landscaping battles. They were accusing me of the following: a disruption of community character, unpermitted grading and soil movement near HOA boundaries, and my favorite, potential contamination of the stormwater management system due to non-conforming agricultural intentions. I actually laughed when I read that last part. I wasn't dumping oil barrels or digging latrines, I was composting, using drip irrigation. My soil reports were cleaner than most of their pool filters, but the letter wasn't meant to hold up in court. It was meant to rattle me. So I wrote back, politely, professionally. I attached scanned permit soil analysis results, a copy of my zoning designation, and even an invitation to tour the site, hoping that maybe, just maybe, a little transparency would ease the tension. Their response, silence. Except from Karen. She doubled down. I caught her one morning photographing the south side of my property from the sidewalk. I waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she walked up to the corner utility box, the one I had quietly marked for inspection weeks earlier, and stared at it like it personally offended her. That box was one of the junction points for the grid system I'd inherited partial control over after the merger between my former company and a private renewable infrastructure firm. It wasn't something I talked about often. Most people assumed their electricity just came from the city. But in areas like this, where suburban sprawl had outpaced municipal capacity, smaller infrastructure companies had stepped in buying land easements and access rights. My company had been one of them. And after retirement, I'd negotiated to keep a portfolio of rural assets, including the service contract and maintenance rights to the subgrid that powered Meadow Hills. Meaning legally, technically, and quite literally, I was their power company. At the time, I hadn't planned on using that knowledge. It felt petty. My goal wasn't to dominate, just to build a sustainable life for myself on land that had always been mine. But Karen was pushing harder and harder, and I could feel my restraint wearing thin. She kept sending letters. Not directly, of course. Everything came on behalf of the board or per recommendations from the community compliance officer. They cited obscure passages in their HOA charter documents that didn't apply to me and continued to pile on daily fines in a spreadsheet emailed weekly, as if I owed her rent for existing. Rico started bringing his guys in earlier just to avoid the possibility of confrontation. One morning, we arrived to find all of our construction markers yanked out of the ground and thrown into the drainage culvert. Another morning, the portable toilet was knocked over, contents leaking into the gravel. Teenagers Rico offered, though, without much conviction. I shook my head. Too consistent. And too cowardly to do it while we're here. That's when I installed cameras. Not big flashy ones, just small motion-triggered wildlife cams, tucked into fence posts and trees. Within 3 nights, I had footage of 2 individuals in reflective vests sneaking onto the property and scattering chicken feed across the dirt lot where I planned to pour concrete. At first, I was confused until the next morning, when a neighbor called animal control to report an unusual number of predators on my land. Sure enough, a pack of coyotes had rolled through. No damage done, but the implication was clear. This was harassment, but still, I stayed above it. I sent the footage to Carla, my lawyer, and began the process of building a harassment claim. She agreed this wasn't about HOA enforcement anymore. They're trying to bury you in paperwork and fear, she said. It won't work, I told her. But part of me was getting tired of being the reasonable one. Tired of having to prove again and again that I had the right to live and work on my own land. Then came the moment that shifted everything. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had just come back from a meeting with the solar team and was checking my email when I saw it, an official notice from the county power office requesting confirmation on the status of electrical line access contracts for Meadow Hills. Apparently, someone from the HOA had requested an emergency review of their grid provider. The irony, that review request had triggered an internal audit. And during that audit, my name popped up, my contract, my rights, my control. The county rep even called to confirm. Mr. Merrick, are you aware that your infrastructure group owns the service access for transformer nodes 9B through 11D? Yes, I said slowly, I'm very aware. There was a long pause. Well, sir, he said then, I'm sure you also know that the Meadow Hills HOA is overdue for renewal on their access license and has been operating on a courtesy extension. I smiled then, not out of malice, but out of relief. Because for the first time since this fight began, I saw the path forward. They'd been trying to break me with bureaucracy, with noise papers' threats. But power was my language, and now finally the lights were about to turn. The following morning, I stood on my back deck with a coffee in hand, watching the mist rise off the field where my future greenhouse would sit. The dew shimmered. The land was quiet still. But my phone wasn't. Before I even finished my first cup, I had 3 voicemails and 2 new emails, all with subject lines that included words like urgent cease or liability. Karen had found out. Not about the audit directly, she wouldn't have access to that. But someone somewhere had whispered something to someone on her board. The timing was too precise. The energy had shifted overnight. Her tactics had always been controlling, but now they were panicked. The first email came from a generic HOA address. Dear Mr. Merrick, it began. We have reason to believe that your construction activity poses a risk to the electrical infrastructure that services our community. As such, we are demanding an immediate halt to all excavation or structural modifications until a neutral third-party assessor can verify your compliance. I laughed. A third-party assessor on private land. They were grasping now, trying to assert authority they didn't have. The next message was bolder. It came from Karen's personal Gmail account. No headers, no formalities, just a block of text riddled with legal buzzwords and veiled threats. Alan, it read, I don't think you realize the risk you're putting yourself and others in by proceeding without appropriate community engagement. We've been advised that your project could interfere with buried infrastructure, some of which the HOA has a fiduciary obligation to maintain. If this continues, we'll be forced to pursue an emergency injunction. She copied 3 other board members, and for the first time she included a name I recognized, Richard Collier, a local attorney who moonlighted as general counsel for several HOAs in the region. He wasn't high-powered, but he had a reputation he liked to file, liked to intimidate, and liked to stretch the interpretation of easements until they snapped. Carla, my lawyer, read the messages and just chuckled. This isn't legal positioning, it's theater. Still, it signaled something dangerous. Karen wasn't just trying to bluff me anymore. She was trying to lay a paper trail, something she could show in court later to make it seem like she had tried to negotiate, tried to warn me. It was a setup, so we responded, carefully. Carla drafted a formal letter, one that clarified the boundaries, the easement rights, the zoning authority, and the precise legal limits of the HOA's reach. We cited their own charter. We included copies of the energy access contracts showing I was not only permitted, but legally empowered to maintain and control the electrical infrastructure they depended on. And then, we made a simple request: stop interfering. Cease communication unless directed through counsel. Any further attempt to obstruct lawful construction or imply jurisdiction would be considered harassment and pursued accordingly. We sent it. Certified mail, email. A printed copy hand-delivered to the HOA Dropbox. Everything documented. And that's when the phone calls started. Not from Karen, she went silent, but from neighbors. Some angry, some confused. A few even apologetic. One man, Brian Kerrigan, came by in person. He wore a polo with the HOA logo and looked like he regretted every second of what he was about to say. "I just need to ask Alan," he said, standing by my fence. "Are you really threatening to cut our power?" I blinked. "Excuse me. Karen said you might shut off the clubhouse or the pool." I almost laughed. Did she mention why I might do that? He looked down. "Something about a contract renewal," I sighed. Brian, the HOA's access to the utility junction was set to expire last fiscal year. They've been using it on a courtesy extension. No fees, no updates. I haven't enforced any of it. But Karen's been pushing me since the day I broke ground. I've ignored the drones, the fake violations, the harassment, and now she's escalating. He nodded, not defending her, not accusing me either. Just caught in the middle. "I just don't want this to become a thing," he said. "We've got the 4th of July cookout next week, and I don't want this to become a thing either," I interrupted more firmly. "But I won't be bullied off my own land." Brian left quietly. But later that evening, the narrative changed. A new email from the HOA sent to the entire community listserv went out with the subject line: "Energy infrastructure at risk, urgent community briefing." In it, Karen claimed my construction had damaged or endangered multiple service lines and posed a possible interruption to community services. She framed me as an uncooperative landowner, someone who refused to meet, refused to listen, and who now might endanger sensitive residents with reckless digging. It was a smear campaign, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. The next morning, a stack of concerned resident flyers appeared on windshields throughout the neighborhood. One of my subcontractors found one tucked under his wiper blade, with a note scribbled in ink: "We know what you're doing." Then someone filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming I was conducting commercial excavation without environmental review. Another false report. And another inspection was triggered. This time, it wasn't just a drone or Karen's Lexus that showed up. It was a white city vehicle with a seal on the door. The inspector stepped out, hard hat and clipboard in hand, and asked if he could walk the perimeter. I agreed because I had nothing to hide. He found nothing. No violations, he told me plainly. "Looks like you're doing everything right." But when I asked if the complaint had come from the HOA, he just raised an eyebrow, didn't say. But these kinds of complaints usually come from someone with time and a grudge. That evening, I got the call that pushed me over the line. "It was Rico. Boss," he said, voice tight. "Someone tampered with the generator storage. The backup fuses are gone." "What?" "We locked that box. Padlock's gone too. Not busted, just replaced." That wasn't a prank. That was sabotage. I filed a police report, and then I made the decision. Karen wanted to play power games. She wanted to weaponize gossip, legalese, and fear. But I had something better. I had control. The HOA's contract with my company, my infrastructure trust, was hanging by a thread. Their access license was expired. Their board hadn't responded to renewal notices in over a year. All I had to do was let that expiration run its course. No malice. No action at all. Just silence. And in 10 days, the lights would go out. You can tell when people realize they've gone too far. It's never loud, not at first. It comes with a sudden shift in the tone, a quiet urgency to fix what they broke without admitting they broke it. That was Karen now. After weeks of posturing threats and drone-fueled surveillance, her HOA board had begun making calls to lawyers, to neighbors, and finally to the county. But they didn't call to apologize. They called to escalate, to validate their narrative, to try and bury me under bureaucracy. The first inspector showed up 2 days after Rico found the lock had been switched on the generator storage shed. This one didn't come in a white city truck or carry a government ID. He wore khakis, a tucked-in polo, and the nervous energy of a man who knew he wasn't supposed to be there. "Name's Russ," he said, avoiding eye contact. "I'm with Community Code Review Solutions." "Never heard of you," I replied flatly. "We're contracted by several HOAs and municipalities to provide third-party assessments for potential environmental impact." "Are you from the county?" "No, sir. Independent." "Do you have a warrant or an inspection order?" "No, sir. Just a request from the Meadow Hills HOA for a courtesy site review." I folded my arms. "You can turn around." He stood there for a moment weighing whether to push, then nodded awkwardly and walked back to his truck. Not even 5 hours later, a second inspection crew arrived. This time they were legit city-issued badges clipboards, and that overly formal tone government folks take on when they know the complaint is bogus, but protocol demands they follow through. They cited 2 anonymous complaints filed within 24 hours. One alleged that I was illegally diverting water flow from the culvert along Karen's street. The other claimed I had built unauthorized structures too close to the protected migratory path of local wildlife, namely, a species of hawk I'd never even seen. "We have to verify the claims, Mr. Merrick," one of them said, voice polite but firm. Shouldn't take more than an hour. I let them through, of course. I had nothing to hide. They took photos, made notes, asked questions they already knew the answers to. At the end, they thanked me professionally and promised a report within 72 hours. The next morning, I got another visit, this time from a woman in a navy pantsuit and blazer, carrying a leather portfolio and the clipped tone of a compliance officer who had spent too long on the phone with angry board members. "I'm here regarding allegations of non-permitted electrical modification and potential risk to neighborhood service continuity." I blinked. "And where exactly are these modifications happening?" She hesitated, flipping pages. "There's mention of trenching unauthorized equipment staging and proximity to residential grid components." "Interesting," I said, "because the only electrical equipment I've touched is my own." I let her walk the perimeter with my site manager. She saw the same thing the others had. Nothing. Every trench flagged, every digger legally contracted, every storage unit locked and inventoried. She even paused at one of the transformer access gates, the same ones I technically owned, and scribbled something in her notepad. "Everything seems compliant," she admitted quietly. But I knew how this worked. Karen wasn't trying to stop me through facts. She was trying to drown me in doubt, paperwork, fear. Each new inspector brought more questions. Each question brought delays. And the delays chipped away at the trust of workers, neighbors, even subcontractors. I started getting emails from teams asking if I was still clear to proceed. One plumber dropped out of the bid process altogether, citing possible legal entanglements with the HOA. Word travels fast in rural contracting circles. Karen was using whispers like weapons, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I spent that week preparing a package, one that would make it very, very hard for anyone to question my position going forward. It included a notarized copy of the original utility infrastructure license signed by my former company and the private energy cooperative now under my trust. The expired access contract with Meadow Hills, marked with red underlines highlighting the lapse date. A report from our compliance team showing the HOA had failed to renew after 3 official notices, none of which they responded to. And finally, a statement drafted by Carla outlining the legal authority I had to initiate review, restrict access, or require renegotiation of service rates. I sent it certified mail to the HOA's official mailing address. One copy went to Richard Collier, their lawyer. One went to the county utilities liaison. I even dropped a hard copy into Karen's personal mailbox, signed and dated. No response. But the silence was heavy now, different. Rico noticed it first. They're watching, but not talking. He was right. The drones had stopped. The passive-aggressive HOA newsletters gone. Karen's car still drove slowly past the lot, but she never got out. The neighbors had gone quiet too. The ones who used to stop and ask questions now looked away like I'd become radioactive. And then, on a Thursday afternoon just before sunset, I got the call that confirmed what I suspected. It was from the county power liaison, a woman named Marla, whom I'd worked with for over a decade. "Alan," she said, "I just wanted to give you a heads up." The Meadow Hills HOA tried to file for emergency service renewal, said their community clubhouse and pool were facing potential interruption. I smiled slowly. And I told them that the contracts expired, that they ignored 3 notices, that the infrastructure owner has full discretion to review or pause service, and that if they have concerns, they can contact the infrastructure owner directly. Did they? No, she said, but I doubt they will. They sounded startled. We hung up. I stood in the gravel driveway under the soft orange light of the setting sun and let the weight of the moment sink in. Karen had used every weapon in her HOA arsenal: letters, threats, public shaming inspectors. But what she never saw coming, what she never bothered to ask about, was who owned the ground beneath her feet. She assumed the grid was untouchable. That power was invisible, neutral, universal. But out here in this stretch of land, in this small pocket of tangled contracts and aging infrastructure, power wasn't abstract. It was mine, and I was done letting her pretend otherwise. The next morning, I instructed our legal team to draft a formal notice. Termination of courtesy energy extension. Meadow Hills Common Use Zones. I didn't touch the homes. I didn't touch any family's lights or heat or basic service. But I drew a line. No more clubhouse lights. No more HOA meeting hall AC. No more fountain pumps for their entrance sign. No more free grid access without contract renewal, and this time on my terms. The notice was delivered by courier. Karen didn't reply, but that Saturday night, during what was supposed to be their big community mixer, the power cut out at 6:01 p.m., exactly when I said it would. And from my back deck, I watched the darkness ripple across the subdivision like a wave. The stars at least still belonged to everyone. The silence after the blackout was unlike any I'd heard before. Not the peaceful quiet I sought when I first came out here, but the stunned stillness of people who had never been told no. The clubhouse at Meadow Hills had gone dark mid-sentence, right in the middle of Karen's speech. I imagined her standing there, clutching a stack of HOA updates, blinking at the lights as they flickered out, her voice caught in her throat. She hadn't responded to the service termination notice, nor had her lawyer. They probably assumed it was just another empty threat, a bluff. But they forgot I'd built grids like this, negotiated the contracts, owned the stakes, and now that their free ride was over, they had to face a truth they'd refused to acknowledge. They didn't own everything. The next morning, I made coffee like I always did. But instead of walking the ranch line or reviewing greenhouse plans, I walked into my study and pulled out a thick, dust-covered file from the bottom drawer of my oak cabinet. Inside were documents most people wouldn't think twice about: land transfer records, utility easement, maps, historical service contracts from decades back. But I knew better. These papers were power, literally. I laid the documents out across the dining table, sorting them like puzzle pieces. Each one told a story of a neighborhood built too fast, relying on borrowed infrastructure, expanding beyond the reach of city lines. When Meadow Hills was developed, they hadn't built their own power lines. They'd tapped into an existing subgrid owned by a small energy company called ArcBridge Utilities. Back then, no one thought twice about it. ArcBridge maintained the transformers, the lines, and the easements. HOA just paid a simple fee. But ArcBridge didn't survive the last recession. My company acquired their assets in 2011, and when I retired, my severance included something unusual: a partial portfolio of low-maintenance infrastructure, including several grid segments with expiring HOA contracts. It was meant to be passive income, the kind of retirement asset that just quietly did its job. Until Karen made it personal. I had the deed maps showing the right-of-way across my land. I had the transformer logs, the access logs, the renewal history, and I had something more powerful than any of that non-renewal silence from the HOA itself. They'd had 3 chances to sign a new contract. They ignored all of them. When I reached the final page, I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The easement didn't just grant access, it also granted me the right to inspect, suspend, or redirect utility access through alternate routing in the case of contractual violation or administrative lapse. In plain English, if a client broke the terms, I could cut them off or make them renegotiate from scratch. I hadn't thought I'd ever need to use that clause, but now it was my shield. Just then my phone buzzed. Caller ID Carla Price. "Morning, Alan," she said. "You should probably sit down." I was already sitting. "Go ahead." "I just got word that the HOA filed an injunction request. They're claiming your blackout was retaliatory and that it poses a public safety risk." I smiled. Expected that. They also attached a community petition, 78 signatures asking the court to reinstate emergency energy access to Meadow Hills public zones. They want me to power their clubhouse again without a contract. Basically, let them sue. We warned them, documented everything. This is exactly why I kept the logs. She was quiet for a moment. Alan, I know you. You're not a vindictive man. I'm not, I agreed. But I'm done pretending I owe them something. After we hung up, I drove down to the south corner of my property, where the junction box stood one of the main hubs that served the HOA common zones. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached it. A padlock sat on the access gate. Mine. Still intact. Next to it, a small laminated copy of the termination notice fluttered in the wind. I knelt, opened the utility housing with my key, and ran a quick diagnostic. All circuits were healthy, nothing damaged. The blackout had been surgical, just the clubhouse, the pool equipment, and the sprinkler pumps for their ornamental landscaping. I hadn't touched any residential lines. My intention wasn't harm, it was clarity. I sealed the box, stood, and turned. Karen was there. She was standing 20 feet back on the HOA side of the fence, arms crossed, jaw tight. She wore the same windbreaker she always did when playing authority figure, but her stance wasn't as confident this time. She looked like someone who had just realized the ground under her feet wasn't hers after all. I hope you're satisfied, she said, her voice brittle. No, I replied. I'm just getting started. You're punishing the entire community because you're bitter over a zoning dispute. No, I repeated calmly. I'm enforcing a contract you ignored. This isn't about zoning. It's about respect. And you lost that the moment you tried to push me off land that was never yours. She shifted, suddenly less sure. This neighborhood has a standard to maintain. We've spent years building this community, and your operation undermines it. I'm not undermining anything. You don't like goats, fine. But I didn't knock over fences. I didn't fly drones. I didn't spread false reports or send strangers to dig through my yard at night. That hit her. She looked away, blinking. For a moment, I saw something in her face. That wasn't anger, it was fear. Not of me, but of losing control. Of the fragile illusion that she had built slipping. I'll see you in court, she said, but there was no bite in it. I look forward to it. She turned and walked away, her steps smaller now. And I realized she wasn't the threat anymore. She'd become the face of a war she could no longer win. The real battle now was public opinion, the neighbors, the board, the people who didn't yet understand how close they'd come to losing everything because of one woman's pride. I went home and called Carla. Let's draft a proposal, I told her. New terms for a renewed contract with permanent protections for my ranch and public acknowledgement of the HOA's past interference. And if they refuse, she asked. They won't, I said. They're in the dark now, literally. That evening, I watched the sun sink behind the trees, while the clubhouse sat lifeless, just a silhouette against the orange horizon. I sipped my bourbon, slowly, feeling no guilt. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. And the lines, both legal and electrical, were now drawn exactly where they needed to be. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't post anything online or call a press conference or go door to door like Karen had done when she rallied her neighbors against me. That wasn't my style. My retaliation wasn't loud. It was lawful, quiet, and backed by more documentation than the entire HOA could muster in a year of meetings. I called it strategic pressure. And it began with a simple routine email to my infrastructure team: do not auto-renew Meadow Hills access agreements. Require full compliance review before any future reactivation. Just that. No threats, no emotion. Just enforcement of what was already legally within my right. And then we waited. It took 3 days for the HOA to realize that their sprinkler systems weren't just malfunctioning. They had no power. Their pool pumps were off, clubhouse air conditioning non-functional, and the electric gate at their main entrance dead. Residents started calling the HOA board, asking why their fobs didn't work anymore. Karen responded with deflection. We're investigating a service issue. She blamed the county, blamed a technical miscommunication, and even tried to suggest someone had vandalized the transformer. But it was hard to maintain that story when the transformer was located on my land, protected by my locks, and had not been touched except by authorized personnel. I expected anger, and I got it. Angry emails, anonymous notes in my mailbox. One neighbor, a man named Rick, who had always seemed reasonable before, walked past my driveway one evening and muttered "power-hungry prick" loud enough for me to hear. I didn't react. I knew what they were being told. But I also knew how quickly narratives collapse when they meet facts. So I published my own. Not a social media blast. I wasn't about drama. Instead, I sent a printed newsletter folded and delivered quietly to every home in Meadow Hills. No sarcasm. No blame. Just a timeline of events, a copy of the expired access contract, and a paragraph explaining why the termination occurred. Because the HOA leadership refused to respond to 3 notices over the course of 18 months, despite receiving continuous service without payment adjustment. I attached a copy of the easement diagram and invited any resident to request a full legal explanation via email. I even included my attorney's contact. Within 48 hours, the emails started trickling in. Some were defensive. This isn't what we were told. Some were confused. Wait, you own the grid access? But a few were apologetic. I didn't realize the HOA had let things expire. Thank you for the clarity. Even Brian Kerrigan, the same board member who'd once stood at my fence looking uncomfortable, sent a short but pointed message. Would you be willing to meet with us without Karen? That was the turning point. Karen didn't go quietly, of course. When she realized the board was discussing reactivation without her, she called an emergency executive meeting in the darkened clubhouse using flashlights and a portable generator. Only 3 members showed up. The rest had started to see what I already knew, that her leadership had led them into a mess they couldn't litigate their way out of. Meanwhile, I kept my retaliation measured. No escalation, no threats, but I began tightening the screws. We flagged the HOA for a delayed maintenance review, a routine audit required by our private infrastructure company for any party with expired contracts who had continued drawing energy. That triggered an inspection of their wiring compliance, which we conducted professionally, thoroughly, and legally. We found problems. A frayed conduit behind the pool pump room. An improperly sealed junction box behind the clubhouse bar. Nothing catastrophic yet. But all violations. Enough to warrant a formal warning and deny reactivation until repairs were made and verified by an approved technician. Karen tried to argue the findings. She claimed sabotage. She accused my team of manipulating the review. She even filed a complaint to the County Ethics Board claiming conflict of interest. But her claims went nowhere. I had insulated myself legally from every step. The review had been conducted by third-party contractor specialists whose credentials even the county respected. By the end of the week, Karen's reputation was unraveling. She'd spent months preaching about protecting community standards, yet here she was ignoring basic infrastructure safety, hiding expired contracts, and failing to secure the very utilities she claimed to govern. And still, I hadn't said a word to her directly since that day at the junction box. I didn't need to. One evening, as I was reviewing progress notes on the barn construction, I received a knock on the door. Not a pounding, not angry, just a firm, polite knock. I opened it to find Brian standing on my porch. He looked tired, dignified, but worn. "Alan," he said, "we had a vote." I raised an eyebrow. A vote to suspend Karen indefinitely from the HOA executive board. I said nothing, just waited. He took a breath. "She still holds the title, but the rest of the board agreed she doesn't speak for us anymore. And we'd like to negotiate a new access agreement. One that works for both sides. And that includes formal acknowledgement of your ranch's right to develop." I nodded slowly, my expression unreadable. "I'll have Carla send over a preliminary draft." He hesitated, then added, "You should know not everyone agrees. There's still resentment, but most of us just want peace." "So do I said simply. He left with a quiet nod, and I closed the door behind him, exhaling a breath that had been building for months. This wasn't over. Not yet. But something had changed. Not because I shouted louder, but because I stood firm, methodical, patient. Because I used the very tools Karen tried to weaponize against me, legality process, documentation, and turned them back on her without ever breaking a single rule. And now they were the ones asking for terms. I stepped outside that night, walked down to the edge of the property where the newly planted orchard stood, and looked out over the distant lights flickering across the neighborhood. Not from the clubhouse that was still dark, but from the individual homes, the families, the people who would eventually realize that I wasn't their enemy. I was just the guy who finally turned the lights on. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 6:00 p.m. sharp. And for the first time in the neighborhood's well-documented history, the agenda didn't start with a smug speech from Karen Holt. In fact, it didn't start at all, because her power was gone. The clubhouse parking lot was full that evening. Neighbors arrived expecting explanations, apologies, and maybe even an argument or two. Some carried folding chairs. A few brought flashlights. What they didn't bring was patience. Karen had promised them an urgent update regarding the infrastructure issue. She had printed flyers herself, half facts, and vague legal jargon that made it seem like she was heroically negotiating on their behalf. Unfair targeting by a hostile energy partner was the phrase she'd bolded. But when they opened the doors to the clubhouse that evening, it was hotter than an Arizona attic in July. The fans were dead. The outlets were useless. The lights clicked on for half a second, then fizzled out with a mechanical sigh. The PA system that Karen loved to use to amplify her voice wouldn't even hum. She was pacing when Brian arrived. He told me this later after the chaos had cooled. Said she was red-faced, standing at the fuse box like it was some kind of puzzle she could solve by force of will. "This is sabotage," she hissed at anyone who would listen. "It's intentional interference. We are being attacked." But Brian knew better. So did the rest of the board. They'd seen the contracts now. The renewal notices, the inspection reports, the warnings. The 3 separate chances they'd had to simply comply, and Karen had ignored every one. When Karen tried to open the meeting anyway, speaking loudly in the flickering glow of a backup lantern, she made it exactly 2 minutes in before someone stood up and said what most had been thinking for weeks. Karen said, "A woman from the back. Why didn't you just renew the damn contract?" A silence fell over the room, thick accusatory. Karen blinked. "I didn't have the authority." "You had it for the bake sale budget," someone else shouted. "You had it to find me over a birdbath. You had it when you ordered security cameras for the gate. But you didn't have it to renew the electricity contract." Another voice, "You said Alan was bluffing." Karen faltered. He's not even part of the community. He doesn't live under HOA jurisdiction. He's a threat." Brian finally stepped forward. "No, Karen. He's a neighbor, one with legal rights, and we've been violating them." For the first time, Karen looked small. Not weak. She'd never allow that, but cornered. Her hands fluttered as if looking for something to hold on to, some document or ordinance to shield her. But there was nothing left to grab. That night ended in candlelight and confusion. The board adjourned early. Some members stayed behind, talking quietly in pairs. A few simply walked out, tossing their flyers in the trash without a glance. Karen lingered until the end, standing in the dark near the old podium, staring at the shadow of a banner that read, "Meadow Hills, a community in harmony." It might as well have been a joke now. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I was reviewing soil delivery schedules for my new greenhouse when I got a text from Brian. That clubhouse power officially failed during Karen's meeting. It's over. I set the phone down slowly, feeling a strange blend of satisfaction and melancholy. I hadn't wanted to destroy anyone, but I also hadn't come here to be pushed around. The next morning, the formal request arrived. Not from Karen, from the rest of the HOA board. They wanted a meeting, a real one, on my terms. It was held on neutral ground, a small community center outside HOA jurisdiction. Brian led the group, flanked by 2 other members I'd seen at previous meetings, but never spoken to directly. They nodded politely. Karen was nowhere in sight. "We've reviewed the draft." Brian began unfolding his own highlighted copy of the proposed energy access agreement. "There are a few things we'd like to discuss." Carla didn't blink. "We're open to clarification, but non-negotiable on the foundational terms." He nodded as if expecting that. They went line by line, nothing aggressive, just clarifications. They asked about language around liability, waivers, about the process for rate recalculations should infrastructure costs change. But when we reached WABR's Section 12B, the room got still. HOA acknowledges that Merrick Ranch lies outside its jurisdiction and agrees not to issue citations, initiate fines, or interfere with permitted development on said property. Brian cleared his throat. "Some of our community members have asked whether this clause sets a precedent." Carla leaned forward. "It sets a boundary. You overstepped. Now you're acknowledging that." The room was quiet. Finally, Brian said, "We agree to that clause." That's when I spoke. "I'm not asking you to like my ranch," I said, voice steady. "I'm asking you to leave it alone." "We will," Brian said, his tone quieter now. It was a simple exchange, but it meant everything. From there, the negotiations wrapped quickly. The HOA would retroactively compensate for the unbilled grid usage over the past 18 months, undergo mandatory inspection for their common zone, wiring, and repair all flagged violations at their expense, reinstate their energy access through a signed contract with full renewal accountability, and most important to me, file a public correction in the next community newsletter acknowledging the ranch's autonomy and their own lapse in contract management. The last item wasn't about ego. It was about resetting the narrative. Karen had spent months painting me as a rogue landowner, a threat to neighborhood order. I didn't need praise, but I did need truth. After everyone signed, Carla gathered the documents into her briefcase, clicked it shut, and smiled faintly at me. We stood. The board members did too. Brian extended his hand. To clarity, he said. I shook it. To boundaries. They left without fanfare. Later that evening, I sat on my porch as the sun dipped low behind the cypress trees. The air was soft, warm, buzzing faintly with crickets and the occasional gust of breeze. I was supposed to feel victorious, I suppose, but it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a repair, like I'd just finished stitching something that should never have torn in the first place. My phone buzzed. It was a message from June, the retired librarian, who had once gently asked if I was following the proper procedures. She'd been quiet for months. I read the HOA's letter. I'm sorry it took so long for the truth to come out. If you ever open that school garden program you talked about, I'd love to volunteer. I stared at it for a long time, a smile curling at the edge of my mouth. The next morning, the lights were back on at the clubhouse. The sprinklers hummed in the early morning mist. The HOA's electric gate blinked back to life. Life as they knew it resumed. But the signs of change were there. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now waved. A teenager rode his bike past the ranch and shouted, "Cool barn." The drone stopped entirely, and Karen. I hadn't seen her since the day she showed up with folded hands and a folded heart. A week later, a small article appeared in the Meadow Hills newsletter tucked between pet adoption tips and a recipe for summer pasta salad. The HOA board would like to formally acknowledge that the Merrick Ranch operates independently of HOA governance. Previous misunderstandings have been addressed through legal and contractual resolution. We value our neighbors and strive for peaceful coexistence. That was it. No fanfare, no apology. But the words were there, and they were mine. I framed that page, not out of pride, but as a reminder. That power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly behind deeds, behind contracts, behind fences built not to keep people out, but to keep truth in. I got back to work. The barn was nearly finished. The solar panels had arrived. The greenhouse was weeks from planting. And I'd started sketching out the curriculum for the school garden composting water cycle's native plants. I wasn't here just to win. I was here to grow. The newsletter changed everything. Not in volume, not in tone, but in weight. Those 78 words buried in paragraph 3 carried more influence than a dozen HOA meetings ever had. It was the first time the community saw the truth acknowledged in writing, not just whispered behind clipped hedges or exchanged in cautious driveway conversations. That subtle admission that the HOA had overstepped, that the ranch was not under their rule, shifted the air across Meadow Hills like a quiet earthquake. It began with the small things. A couple named Frank and Diane, who lived in the Tudor-style house at the corner of Cottonwood Drive, dropped off a tray of lemon bars at my gate. No note. Just a gesture. 2 kids I'd never seen before rode their scooters down my private gravel lane, waved shyly, and asked if they could see the goats. I said yes. They laughed at how the smallest one sneezed like an old man. But more than the kindness, there was something deeper happening. A rebalancing. Residents began demanding clarity. They started asking questions at meetings, not just about my land, but about everything Karen had once handled with ironclad control budget, line items, surveillance approvals, vendor contracts that never went to vote. It was as if once the myth of absolute authority had been pierced, the rest of the structure no longer felt so sacred. Brian told me about it during a short walk around my greenhouse plot one morning. She controlled everything, he said, shaking his head. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She just knew the system better than the rest of us. Until You. I looked at him. I didn't do anything special. You did what most people don't, he replied. You didn't back down. I didn't respond, but the words settled in me. Heavy. True. 2 weeks later, I got a formal invitation, not from the board this time, but from a group of residents organizing a special election to revise the HOA charter. They weren't just reacting to Karen's behavior, they wanted structural change. The proposal included term limits for board members, so no one could hold executive power indefinitely. Mandatory transparency reports for any enforcement action or fine issued. A public review process for budget expenditures over $5,000. And most boldly, an exemption clause for properties deemed legally autonomous under county zoning, formally removing HOA claim to any land like mine. They asked if I would attend the vote, not to speak, not to advocate, but simply to be present. I said yes. That night, I walked into the clubhouse for the first time in months. The air was cool again. The lights were on. The fountain at the entrance had resumed its pointless bubbling, and the hallway smelled faintly of lavender air freshener and paper coffee cups. The place was packed. I recognized faces from every corner of the subdivision: young couples, retirees, parents with toddlers. The tension wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something more active. People weren't afraid anymore. They were alert. Karen sat in the back row, not at the table. She wore a cream sweater, her mouth a thin line, eyes darting from one speaker to the next. She didn't interrupt, didn't stand. When her name was mentioned during discussion, she stared at the floor. When the amendment to remove her voting privileges passed with a supermajority, she didn't flinch. It wasn't vindication. It was history folding in real time. When the vote finally came on all 4 reform amendments, the tally was overwhelming. Yes. 312. No. It was done. I walked home under a sky full of stars, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The cicadas buzzed in waves. My barn light blinked as I approached motion sensor triggered by a tired man with dust on his collar and freedom in his lungs. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post about it. I just walked inside, poured a single glass of rye, and sat on my porch while the wind curled around the corners of the ranch like an old friend returning. That weekend, Brian came by with a clipboard. "Do you still want to build that solar farm?" he asked. I looked up. "Why?" "Well," he said, flipping the page, "the HOA has decided to formally divest from their current utility model. They're open to new options, sustainable ones. You were right about what's possible out here, and the residents trust you now." "Brian," I said slowly, "are you asking me to power the neighborhood?" He shrugged. "We figured it'd be poetic." I smiled. Not because of the irony, but because of the opportunity. Not to get even, but to build something better. A week later, I submitted a proposal. A community solar array, discreetly placed along the southeast ridge. Discounted usage rates for Meadow Hills homeowners who opted in. Free power for all HOA common zones in perpetuity. And in return, a 5-acre buffer zone between my ranch and the HOA boundary, never to be governed, cited, or touched. It passed without resistance. And just like that, the HOA that once tried to strangle my project became my first energy client. Not through war, through design. As summer faded into early fall, construction crews came and went. Panels were mounted, wiring strung. Kids rode their bikes along the property edge to watch workers climb ladders and drill plates into place. The same people who once avoided me now waved through their windshields. I received a thank you card in the mail. Handwritten, no return address. It read, "You didn't just protect your land. You reminded us we were part of something bigger. Thank you." I placed it next to the framed newsletter page in my study. Outside, the goats bleated in the dusk. The orchard leaves shimmered under the first golds of October. The ranch was still mine, but now so was the peace. Autumn arrived gently that year. The wind shifted with just enough bite to rattle the pecan branches near the greenhouse, and the mornings began cloaking the fields in a soft silver mist. The ranch was quiet, content. But what struck me most wasn't the land, it was the neighborhood beyond the fence. Meadow Hills had changed. The political war had ended not in a bang, but in quiet restructuring. HOA board meetings were now attended voluntarily. The club newsletters started highlighting local gardens and bake sales again, instead of community surveillance or parking violations. And the name Karen Holt stopped appearing altogether. Someone else took over the newsletters, someone younger. They swapped passive-aggressive fonts for warm script and even included a regular column called Porchlight Profiles, where they spotlighted longtime residents. In November, I was asked if I'd like to be featured. I almost declined, not because I was bitter, I wasn't, but because peace once earned should be allowed to settle without stirring. Still, the writer, a college student home for the holidays, was persistent. She came by with a recorder, a yellow legal pad, and eyes full of honest curiosity. So she asked, sitting cross-legged on my porch steps, "What made you decide to power the neighborhood you almost went to war with?" I thought for a long moment, letting my eyes drift to the greenhouse, where warm light filtered through frosted glass. "I never wanted war," I said. "Just room to grow." She nodded, scribbling furiously. "What would you tell other communities going through something like this?" I chuckled. "Get your paperwork in order, and don't confuse authority with ownership." That became the pull quote in the article. The solar array came online on the first day of December. I remember because the workers were still wearing fleece jackets and gloves when they switched the system live. It was early morning. Brian was there standing near the main inverter along with 3 new board members and 2 teenagers from the local environmental club. When the connection clicked and the display screen lit up, there was a small cheer. Nothing theatrical, just satisfaction, relief. From that day on, Meadow Hills ran partially on solar. They saved money, cut emissions. They even put up a plaque at the clubhouse, in partnership with Merrick Ranch Energy for the Future. I walked past that plaque a week later, when I dropped off materials for the new community composting site. The board had voted to install it next to the dog park. They asked for my help planning it. The irony didn't escape me, but by then irony had turned into harmony. I received more visitors in those winter weeks than I had the entire year before. Parents with kids wanting to see the goats. A retired electrician offering to help maintain the panel mounts for free. Even June, the librarian, who brought a crate of seed packets and asked if we could start a teaching garden for 3rd graders in the spring. We built raised beds together one weekend. She brought muffins, I brought shovels. Karen never reappeared in any official capacity. I heard she quietly sold her house, left the HOA behind, and moved to a town where she could start fresh. I didn't celebrate her departure, but I also didn't miss her presence. The community had grown in her absence, not in spite, but in clarity. That Christmas, I hosted an open house at the ranch. It wasn't my idea, Brian suggested it. Said it would be a nice gesture. No pressure, he added. Just cookies and cider and a few hay bales for the kids. I said yes. Over 40 families came. Someone brought lights and strung them through the orchard. The goats wore little bells. A girl named Mia sang a solo near the greenhouse, her voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. And me, I stood beside the barn, cider in hand, heart steady. At one point, as twilight crept in and the fire pit crackled in the distance, Brian sidled up beside me. "You know," he said, "this could have ended a lot differently." "It almost did," I replied. He nodded. "I still think about that night, the blackout, the way people panicked, the way Karen talked about you." "What did she say?" He looked thoughtful. "She said you'd destroy the community just to prove a point." I smiled, the firelight flickering on the edge of my boot, and instead I powered it. He grinned. "Yeah, you did." We clinked cider cups. The weeks that followed were quiet, good quiet, fruitful quiet. I spent my days planting, building, teaching. The ranch became what it was always meant to be, a place of creation, not defense. And slowly I stopped checking the mailbox for angry letters. I stopped scanning the skies for drones. I stopped wondering what I'd have to defend next. Because the fight was over. I had reclaimed more than land. I had reclaimed my right to live without apology. And the power I held wasn't just in transformers or easements or contracts. It was in patience, in strategy, in truth. That spring, the garden bloomed wild and full. Bees danced across the lavender rows. Children planted carrots with their bare hands. June read books aloud under the old elm tree. And the community that once tried to exile me now visited with arms open. I never asked to lead. I only asked to be left alone. But sometimes the strongest leaders are the ones who simply endure long enough to become undeniable. And in the end, I didn't just win. I turned resistance into renewal, power into peace, a ranch into a legacy, and a neighborhood into something finally worthy of the name: community.